Emily Carter sat in her small office, surrounded by shelves crammed with books and the unmistakable scent of cold coffee. The fluorescent light flickered slightly, but she hardly noticed as she pored over the file on Noah Graves. He was the subject of the moment among professionals in her field, accused of a series of crimes so brutal that the press had dubbed him the Midnight Executioner. What made the case particularly strange was his behavior. Noah adamantly claimed innocence but described the crime scenes with disturbingly precise detail, as if he'd been there. Most unsettling of all was his insistence that he wasn't acting alone. He claimed to have been guided by something he called the entity. Emily's supervisors had requested her evaluation to determine whether Noah should be transferred to a psychiatric facility. Her reputation as an investigative psychologist was impeccable, but something about this case gnawed at her. Despite her reservations, the lure of a unique case combined with the opportunity to understand such an enigma drove her to accept. It wasn't just curiosity, it felt almost as though she was meant to be there. That night, after finishing her review of the preliminary details, Emily locked up her office later than usual. Rain lashed against the car windows as she drove home. The streets were deserted, and the amber glow of the streetlights cast unsettling shadows on the wet pavement. When she finally arrived home, a strange sense of relief washed over her as she stepped into the warmth of her house. Routine was her refuge. She dropped the papers on the living room table, took a hot shower, and settled onto the couch with a mug of tea. The uneasiness she'd felt all day lingered, but she chalked it up to anxiety over the case. It was natural, she told herself, to feel unsettled when dealing with something so dark. Around midnight, just as she was drifting off to sleep, the doorbell rang. Emily jolted upright, her heart racing at the unexpected sound. The clock read 12 a.m. Sharp. Who could be at her door at this hour? She hesitated for a moment before getting up and making her way to the door. When she opened it, no one was there. Only the wind howled, and raindrops dripped from the eaves. Her eyes fell to the doorstep, where a white envelope had been taped to the frame. For reasons she couldn't explain, her pulse quickened. Emily retrieved the envelope and quickly shut the door. She sat at the dining table, fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with large, uneven handwriting. "He's telling the truth. But you're not safe." For a moment, Emily sat frozen, staring at the words. Who could have written this? How did they know she'd taken Noah Graves' case? The discomfort that had shadowed her all day surged into something darker, like a shadow had entered her home. She carefully folded the note, trying to push away the thoughts crowding her mind. Climbing the stairs, she told herself it was just a cruel prank, maybe someone involved in the case trying to rattle her. Yet, as she turned off the lights, the silence in her house felt deeper than usual. It wasn't just silence, it was the absence of something she couldn't name. For the first time in years, Emily locked her bedroom door before going to sleep. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual, propelled by a restlessness she couldn't shake. The note still sat on her table, but she avoided looking at it, focusing instead on preparing for her first session with Noah. Driving to the prison was an exercise in steadying her nerves, but she maintained her professional composure even as the note's unsettling words echoed in her mind. When she arrived at the prison, the weight of its gray walls and steel gates closing behind her felt oppressive. Yet, what unnerved her the most was the silence within. It was as if the very structure was a tomb, waiting to swallow her whole. A guard escorted her to the interview room. Seated in the cold, metallic chair, Emily waited for Noah Graves to enter. Despite being in a secure facility, the unease from the night before clung to her. When Noah finally stepped into the room, shackled and staring at something behind her rather than at her, Emily knew this evaluation would be far more than just another case. The metallic sound of chains echoed in the small room as Noah Graves was led to the chair across from Emily. He looked younger than she expected, perhaps because of the hollow, lifeless expression in his eyes that contrasted with the brutality of his alleged crimes. Despite being shackled, there was something unnerving about his posture, like the restraints weren't enough to contain him. Emily adjusted her seat, keeping her expression neutral as she opened her notebook. It was crucial to begin calmly, to establish a dynamic of trust, but Noah didn't seem interested in engaging. His gaze was fixed on a point beyond her, as though something else in the room held his attention. For a moment, Emily felt a chill but forced herself to ignore it. "Mr. Graves," she began, her tone firm yet approachable, "how would you prefer I address you during our sessions?" Noah turned his head slowly toward her, as though hearing her for the first time. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was distant, almost mocking. "You don't believe me, do you, Doctor?" he said, ignoring her question entirely. "You think I'm making this all up?" Emily hesitated. It was too early to confront him directly. "I'm here to hear what you have to say," she replied, her voice steady. "My role is to understand your perspective." He let out a low chuckle, barely audible, before leaning forward slightly. "It doesn't matter what I say," he continued. "They always think I'm crazy. But you'll see. They always do, eventually." His words echoed in Emily's mind as she calmly jotted down notes. It was a common tactic among manipulative patients to plant seeds of doubt, to make the other person feel as though they were losing control. But there was something in the way he spoke, in the certainty of his tone, that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Noah continued speaking, but his eyes remained fixed on the point behind her. He began describing the entity, its constant presence, and how it guided him. He didn't use words like demon or spirit, only her. "She doesn't have a shape," he explained. "But you know when she's there. The air changes. She whispers things, shows you things. You don't have a choice." Emily felt the weight of his words but remained skeptical. What he described seemed more like paranoid delusions than tangible reality. Still, she meticulously noted everything. The priority was to document his perceptions and understand the dynamics of what he believed to be true. "Why do you think she chose you?" she asked, steering the conversation towards something more concrete. Noah tilted his head, as though considering the question. "She chooses everyone," he said calmly. "You think you're safe, Doctor? You're not. She already knows who you are." A shiver ran down Emily's spine, but she didn't let it show. It was a psychological game. He was trying to destabilize her, and she knew it. Yet, his words lingered uncomfortably in her mind. The session continued with Noah revealing more details about the crimes, always justifying his actions as being beyond his control. He spoke with a chilling detachment, devoid of remorse, only a dark resignation. To him, the blame belonged to something outside of himself. When the session ended, Emily gathered her notes and thanked him, but Noah interrupted before she could leave. "Doctor," he said, leaning as close as his chains allowed. "Pay attention when you're home. That's how it starts." She froze for a moment but quickly composed herself, leaving the room without looking back. The sound of the steel doors closing behind her was almost comforting. Still, as she walked down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Back in her car, Emily tried to push Noah's words from her mind. He was just a manipulator, skilled at preying on people's insecurities. Yet, as she drove home, she noticed the headlights of a car following her closely. She stopped at a red light and glanced in the rearview mirror, but when the light turned green, the car didn't follow her when she turned left. When she arrived home, everything was as she had left it, but something felt different. The papers on her desk were slightly disarranged, and the pen she always left in the top right corner was now in the center. Small things, insignificant to anyone else, but enough to unsettle her. Sitting on the couch, Emily reviewed her session notes. Noah's parting words echoed in her mind, especially the last phrase, "That's how it starts." She tried to ignore it, but as the silence of the night filled the room, she felt a growing tension, as though something was waiting in the shadows. She locked her bedroom door again that night, something she almost never did. Still, sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, her dreams were vivid and unsettling. She saw Noah sitting in his cell, his head tilted, murmuring something incomprehensible. Then, a faceless shadow loomed behind him, its form shifting and unnatural. The shadow turned to look at her, and she woke up with a start, a scream caught in her throat. Emily sat up in bed, her body covered in sweat and her breathing rapid. The air around her felt heavy. From the corner of her eye, she noticed something on the floor next to her bed. It was a piece of paper. With trembling hands, she picked it up and unfolded it. It was the same handwriting as before, and it bore a single sentence, "Do you see it now?" Emily stared at the piece of paper, her fingers gripping it tightly as she tried to steady her breathing. What had begun as an unsettling curiosity was now morphing into something far more threatening. The uneven handwriting, the words, "Do you see it now?" It was impossible to ignore the creeping dread that accompanied them. She carried the note downstairs, her eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting to catch something out of place. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed, but the feeling of intrusion lingered, a weight she couldn't shake. It was as if something had passed through her home, unseen yet undeniably present. Placing the note on the table alongside the first one, Emily forced herself to focus. Her next session with Noah was days away, but she couldn't wait idly. Determined to push the unease aside, she decided to immerse herself in the case notes. Logic and evidence would be her refuge, her weapon against the chaos threatening to take over. Hours passed as she pored over the file. The details of Noah's crimes were chilling, graphic descriptions of the victim's final moments, all written with a clinical precision that made her stomach churn. There was no discernible connection between the victims, different ages, genders, and backgrounds. And yet, Noah described their deaths as though he'd been compelled, as though someone, or something, had directed his every move. Her phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. She frowned. Almost no one used her landline anymore. Picking up the receiver, she spoke with a controlled calm. "Hello?" Silence greeted her on the other end. For a moment, all she could hear was her own breathing. Then, faintly, came the sound of a slow, deliberate inhale. Emily hung up quickly, her pulse racing. It had to be a prank, she told herself. Someone trying to unsettle her because of the case. But the feeling didn't leave her. The quiet of her home felt oppressive now, the shadows in the corners of the room darker than usual. She decided to leave for some fresh air, hoping the open space would clear her mind. Driving to a nearby park, Emily walked along the winding paths, the damp scent of rain lingering in the air. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering softly. The surroundings should have been comforting, but her sense of unease clung to her like a second skin. She noticed a man sitting on a bench in the distance, his gaze fixed on her. She tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but every time she glanced his way, he remained motionless, his eyes unwavering. Unnerved, Emily returned to her car and drove home, her stomach knotting with tension. When she entered her house, the silence was deafening. She locked the door behind her and walked into the living room. At first glance, everything was as it had been, but a detail caught her attention. The chair at her kitchen table was slightly turned, as though someone had stood up abruptly. She knew she hadn't left it like that. Telling herself it was nothing, she straightened the chair and sat on the couch, determined to stay calm. She tried watching a documentary, but her concentration was broken by the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. She was alone. With shaky hands, she grabbed her phone and climbed the stairs, each step an act of willpower. The hallway was empty, but the door to her bedroom, which she had left open, was now ajar. She nudged it open with her foot, her muscles tense. The room was empty. The lamp on her nightstand flickered once, then stayed steady. Emily exhaled, her body sagging with relief. She ran her hands through her hair and tried to convince herself she was imagining things. Stress. That's all it was. Returning to the living room, she decided to sleep on the couch for the night. But her dreams were relentless. She saw Noah again, sitting in his cell, his body unnaturally still. Behind him, a dark shadow twisted and swirled, shapeless yet menacing. It turned toward her, and though it had no face, she felt its gaze pierce through her. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her breathing ragged. As she sat up, she heard a faint dripping noise from the kitchen. She walked over, her bare feet cold against the floor, and found the faucet dripping steadily, even though she was certain she had turned it off. What made her blood run cold wasn't the faucet. It was the sight of the 2 notes, which she had left on the table, now pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet. The same chilling messages stared back at her, "He's telling the truth. But you're not safe, and do you see it now?" Her hands trembled as she reached for them. The sense of being watched was unbearable, a prickling at the back of her neck that wouldn't go away. Emily looked around the room, but it was just as quiet and still as before. This time, she couldn't push it aside. Sitting back on the couch, the notes clutched in her hands, she tried to make sense of everything. But no matter how much she reasoned with herself, her thoughts kept circling back to Noah's words, "Pay attention when you're home." That's how it starts. Emily woke up with sunlight streaming through the curtains, but the unease from the night before clung to her like a second skin. The 2 notes sat on her table, a silent reminder that something was deeply wrong. She picked them up again, studying the jagged handwriting, but there were no clues, just words that seemed to echo in her mind. Deciding she couldn't let this spiral further, Emily resolved to dig deeper into Noah's case. She poured herself a cup of coffee and opened her laptop, scouring every article and record she could find. The media had sensationalized Noah as a monster, but the official reports were even more disturbing. The victims were seemingly unconnected, different ages, genders, and backgrounds, yet Noah recounted their deaths with eerie precision, claiming he was guided through each act. One name caught her attention, Dr. Peter Holloway. He had been the psychologist assigned to Noah before her, but he had died under mysterious circumstances. The official report listed it as a car accident, but a detail buried in the record sent a chill down her spine. Before his death, Peter had reported to the police that he believed he was being followed. Emily couldn't ignore the coincidence. She called the precinct that had handled Peter's case, but the officer on the line had little to offer beyond the basics. Frustrated but determined, she decided to visit Peter's former office, hoping it might hold answers the investigators had overlooked. The office was in an old building downtown. Emily climbed the creaking stairs to the 3rd floor, where a faded nameplate still bore Peter's name. The door was locked, but after some convincing, the building's janitor reluctantly allowed her inside. The air inside was heavy with the smell of dust and aged wood. The walls were peeling, and the furniture looked as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. Searching through the scattered papers and files, Emily found a cabinet that was locked. The janitor handed her a set of keys, and after fumbling for a moment, she managed to open it. Inside was a trove of patient files, but one folder stood out. It was marked Confidential, Graves Case. Emily opened it to find a small notebook filled with Peter's handwritten notes. The pages were filled with scribbles and fragmented thoughts, but one phrase leapt out at her: "Don't trust your eyes." The words made her pulse quicken. It sounded exactly like something Noah might say. As she read further, Peter's descriptions mirrored Noah's: shadows in the corners of his vision, whispers just beyond hearing, the suffocating sense of being watched. As Emily absorbed the notes, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. She froze, her breath catching. Slowly, she peeked through the partially open door, but the corridor was empty. Shaking off the unease, she tucked the notebook into her bag and left the office. The building felt oppressive, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for her to leave. On the drive home, she noticed a black car in her rearview mirror. At first, she told herself it was just another commuter, but as she made turn after turn, the car stayed with her. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She veered onto a side street, parked behind a delivery truck, and watched as the black car passed by without slowing. When she finally arrived home, Emily locked the door behind her and tossed her bag onto the couch. Her nerves were frayed, but she tried to focus. The notebook from Peter's office was her only lead, and she needed to understand it. She opened it again, flipping through the pages. Near the end, Peter had drawn a series of crude sketches, lines and shapes that initially seemed random. But as Emily studied them, they began to resemble a figure. It was human-like but distorted, with no clear face or features. The sight of it made her stomach churn. A loud clap of thunder shook the house, pulling her from the notebook. The storm outside was intensifying, and the lights flickered briefly. Emily tried to convince herself it was just the weather, but the tension in the air felt heavier than that. She heard a noise from the kitchen, a soft, dragging sound. Heart pounding, she approached cautiously, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. The chairs were in place, the faucet wasn't dripping, but on the floor was something she couldn't explain: the note she had found beside her bed earlier, now crumpled and damp. She bent down to pick it up, her hands trembling. "Do you see it now?" The words stared back at her, as if mocking her inability to escape their meaning. As she stood, the hallway light flickered again, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a shadow move along the far wall. She spun around, but there was nothing. Her breathing was ragged now, her chest tight with fear. Returning to the living room, Emily sat down and opened Peter's notebook again, hoping it might provide some clarity. Near the end, another note caught her eye: "The silence is where she thrives. Don't trust what you feel." The words echoed in her mind, and as the storm raged outside, Emily began to realize she wasn't just unraveling Noah's case, she was becoming part of it. The visitation room at the prison felt even more oppressive the second time. The dull gray walls and heavy silence created a suffocating atmosphere that Emily couldn't shake. Peter Holloway's notebook was tucked securely in her bag, but its contents still echoed in her mind. Delusions, paranoia, those were the logical explanations for what she'd read. And yet, the events surrounding her didn't feel like coincidences. When Noah was brought in, his demeanor was different. He seemed more at ease, his dark eyes glinting with a faint trace of amusement. Even shackled, there was an air of control about him, as though the chains were irrelevant. He sat down slowly, deliberately, and leaned forward. "So, Doctor," he began, his voice soft but sharp, "how are you enjoying her company?" Emily froze for a fraction of a second before regaining her composure. "Who are you referring to, Noah?" she asked, her tone steady, refusing to give him any indication of her unease. He smiled, a thin, knowing smile that only deepened her discomfort. "You know exactly who I'm talking about," he replied. "She's already started. That's why you're here, isn't it? Because you're beginning to see." The room seemed to grow colder. Emily ignored the chill creeping up her spine and pressed on. Noah, you've spoken before about this entity. Can you describe how she communicates with you? Noah tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he was piecing together. She shows things, he said slowly, his tone almost reverent. Images, whispers. Sometimes she moves things. But her favorite trick is making you doubt yourself. She knows exactly what will break you. His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Emily thought of the notes in her home, the shadows, the sound of footsteps in the night. Her logical mind screamed that it wasn't connected, that it couldn't be. But the other part of her, the part that was beginning to fray, whispered otherwise. Why do you think she does this? Emily asked, jotting down notes as calmly as she could. Noah leaned back, his chains clinking softly. Because it feeds her, he said simply. The fear, the doubt, the feeling that you're losing control. That's her sustenance. Emily's pen stilled for a moment before she forced herself to continue writing. And what happens to those who try to resist her? Noah let out a low laugh, devoid of humor. No one resists. You either run, or she consumes you. And, Doctor, you've come too far to run. I can feel it. The fluorescent lights above them flickered briefly, drawing Emily's gaze upward. Noah's smile widened as he watched her reaction. She's here now, he murmured. You feel it, don't you? Emily ignored him, focusing on her notes. She ended the session earlier than planned, unable to endure his gaze any longer. As she gathered her things, Noah spoke one last time. You're already marked, Doctor. It's just a matter of time. Walking out of the room, Emily struggled to steady her breathing. Was she letting him manipulate her? Or was there truth buried in his words? Either way, she knew one thing for certain: she had to understand this connection between Noah, Peter Holloway, and the entity. And more importantly, she had to find a way out before it was too late. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of rain hitting the windshield. Noah's words echoed in her mind, she knows exactly what will break you. It felt like a warning and a prophecy all at once. When she arrived home, the house was as she'd left it, but it no longer felt like a refuge. Emily locked the door and placed her bag on the kitchen table. Her eyes fell on Peter's notebook, and she reluctantly opened it again, flipping through the pages in search of answers. One of the final entries caught her attention: the silence is her domain. Don't trust what you feel. It was the second time she'd seen a warning about silence, and it unsettled her deeply. As if on cue, the room around her grew eerily quiet. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, everything seemed to fade. And then she heard it. A soft, persistent noise, almost like static, coming from the corner of the kitchen. She froze, her breath hitching. The sound grew louder, morphing into a low whisper she couldn't quite understand. It was coming from the notebook. Summoning her courage, Emily touched the notebook, and the sound stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse, thick and heavy, like a tangible force pressing against her. Her phone buzzed suddenly, shattering the stillness. She grabbed it, relieved for the distraction, but the relief was short-lived. A single message illuminated the screen: you can't run from her. Her hands trembled as she stared at the words. She dialed the number, but the line was dead. With a frustrated cry, she threw the phone onto the couch. She was losing control, her grip on reality slipping with each passing moment. She walked into the hallway, hoping movement would calm her nerves. That's when she noticed something hanging on the wall, a photograph she hadn't put there. It was an old picture of her as a child, standing next to her mother, both of them smiling. But there was something wrong. In the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure. It wasn't just a trick of the light, it had form, a presence that sent a jolt of fear through her. Emily stepped closer, her pulse racing, and realized she didn't remember the shadow being there. The air in the hallway felt colder. Emily backed away from the photo and hurried upstairs, locking her bedroom door behind her. She sat on the floor, clutching her knees to her chest, trying to quiet the thoughts that raced through her mind. But as the night wore on, the thoughts refused to settle. She knew now that she was too deep into the case to walk away. The question wasn't whether she could find answers, it was whether she could survive them. Emily sat on the edge of her couch, gripping Peter Holloway's notebook as though it were the only thing tethering her to reality. The shadow she thought she'd seen on the wall upstairs earlier wasn't there anymore, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like enemy territory. The steady sound of rain against the windows only amplified her sense of isolation. She glanced at the clock, it was almost 3 in the morning. She should have been in bed hours ago, but how could she sleep with her nerves on edge, her mind racing? Emily moved through her house, checking every door and window, making sure they were locked. Once satisfied, she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, notebook in hand. Sitting on the bed, she flipped to the back of the notebook, where Peter's last entries were scrawled. One page contained a sketch she hadn't noticed before, a mass of intersecting lines and shapes that at first seemed random. But the longer she stared at them, the more they coalesced into something unsettling. It was a figure. Tall, human-like, but distorted. Its edges bled into the page, as though it refused to be contained within the paper. Emily's stomach twisted, and she pushed the notebook aside. It felt as if the figure was staring back at her. The room felt colder now, and Emily wrapped her arms around herself. She turned off the lights and lay down, forcing her eyes shut. For a brief moment, she thought she might drift off. But a low hum, faint and rhythmic, broke through the silence. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. The sound was like static, but layered with something more, soft whispers that she couldn't quite make out. She looked around, trying to locate the source. The sound seemed to come from the notebook. She hesitated, staring at it from across the room. The hum grew louder, as if daring her to approach. Emily got to her feet, crossed the room, and snatched the notebook off the table. The instant her fingers touched it, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. It pressed down on her like a physical weight, wrapping around her chest and making it hard to breathe. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, the vibration startling her in the quiet. She picked it up with trembling hands and read the message on the screen, "You can't escape her." Emily's breath caught. The number was blocked. She tried calling it, but the line didn't connect. Tossing the phone onto the bed, she paced the room, her thoughts a blur. Everything was unraveling. Every part of her rational mind screamed that this couldn't be real, but how else could she explain it? The hallway light flickered, drawing her attention. Emily froze. Slowly, she stepped into the hall, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. She stopped abruptly when she saw the photo. It was hanging in the hallway, a picture of her and her mother from when she was a child. She remembered the moment clearly. But there was something wrong. She stepped closer, her pulse quickening. In the background of the photo was a shadowy figure. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was distinct, with vaguely human contours but no discernible features. It hadn't been there before. Emily was certain of it. Her vision blurred as her pulse raced. The air around her felt suffocating, heavy with something she couldn't see but could feel. She tore her gaze away from the photo and stumbled back to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. Sitting on the floor with her back against the door, Emily clutched her knees to her chest. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess. She replayed Noah's words over and over in her mind. She knows exactly what will break you. The night passed in fragments. She drifted in and out of restless sleep, her dreams vivid and unnerving. In one dream, she was in the prison again, but Noah's cell was empty. The walls were covered in jagged writing, repeating the same phrase over and over, "She's always been here." When Emily woke, sunlight poured through the window, but the warmth it should have brought was absent. Everything felt muted, as though the world had shifted slightly out of alignment. She got up, washed her face, and tried to shake the lingering unease. But the shadow in the photo haunted her thoughts. Determined to make sense of it all, she returned to Peter's notebook. The last pages seemed different now, the handwriting more erratic, the words harder to decipher. But one message was clear: stop now, before she sees you. Emily closed the notebook with a snap, her hands trembling. She couldn't stop. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to end on its own. And deep down, she knew she was already too far in. Emily sat at her kitchen table, Peter Holloway's notebook open in front of her. The new message, "Stop now, before she sees you," seemed to pulse on the page, its warning echoing in her mind. But there was no turning back. The connections were forming, and even if she didn't fully understand them yet, she couldn't abandon the search for answers. She flipped through the notebook again, reading Peter's frantic entries about the entity's nature, how it thrived in silence, how it could manipulate reality and perception. The descriptions were chillingly similar to what Noah had said during their sessions. Emily couldn't help but wonder if she was following the same path that had destroyed Peter. She needed another perspective, someone who could shed light on what she was uncovering. Her research led her to Marcus Hale, a retired detective who had worked on Noah's case before stepping away from law enforcement entirely. With little hope but no better option, Emily called Marcus and convinced him to meet her at a quiet coffee shop downtown. Marcus arrived looking older than his years, his face lined with worry and exhaustion. His eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. He shook Emily's hand briefly before sitting across from her, bypassing pleasantries entirely. "I knew someone would come looking for me eventually," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "No one touches the Graves case without paying for it." Emily leaned forward, her nerves taut. "What do you mean by that? What do you know about him? And about her?" Marcus exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face. "Graves isn't the first, and he won't be the last. This thing, it's been tied to cases I've worked for over 2 decades. Always the same pattern: senseless violence, random victims, and someone at the center claiming they had no control. At first, we thought it was just an excuse, criminals trying to dodge responsibility. But after a while, you start seeing things." Emily's stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" Marcus hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, as though saying the words aloud might summon something. "It started with little things, objects moving when no one touched them, shadows where there shouldn't be any. But then it got worse. 2 of my partners died while we were working one of these cases. One in a freak accident, and the other. He just disappeared. All I found was a message written in blood on his bathroom mirror: 'You can't escape her.'" Emily's hands trembled, and she clenched them into fists to steady herself. "And you believe this is real?" Marcus locked eyes with her. "I believe it's real in a way we can't understand. It's not physical. It's an idea, a force. It feeds on fear and doubt. And the more you try to understand it, the closer it gets." The words hit Emily like a blow. She felt the weight of them settle over her, a suffocating presence she couldn't shake. But she couldn't stop now. "How do you stop it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shook his head. "You don't. You either walk away and hope it loses interest, or he trailed off, his eyes darkening. "You don't survive long enough to figure it out." The conversation left Emily reeling. She returned home feeling more lost than ever. Marcus had confirmed her worst fears, that this wasn't just in her head. But he'd also given her no solutions, no hope. When she walked through the door, the silence of her house felt heavier than usual. She dropped her bag on the couch and froze when she saw Peter's notebook sitting on the kitchen table, open to a page she hadn't left it on. The message scrawled across the page was unmistakable: "She's closer than you think." Emily's breath quickened as she scanned the room, her eyes darting to every shadow and corner. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from upstairs. She grabbed the nearest object she could find, a heavy book, and crept toward the stairs. Each step felt like walking into a trap, the air around her growing colder with every movement. When she reached the top, the hallway stretched before her, quiet and dimly lit. The door to her bedroom was slightly ajar. Emily pushed it open, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty. But on her bed was something that shouldn't have been there, the photo of her and her mother, now removed from the hallway wall. She stepped closer, dread pulling in her stomach. The shadowy figure in the background seemed clearer now, its edges sharper, more defined. A chill ran down her spine. She couldn't stay here, not anymore. Grabbing her bag and notebook, she fled the house, the sound of her own footsteps echoing behind her. As she started her car and pulled out onto the street, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw someone sitting in the back seat. The prison loomed in the distance, its towering gray walls illuminated by flickering security lights. Emily parked her car, her grip on the steering wheel tightening as she tried to steady her breathing. She had left her home in a rush, driven by the overwhelming feeling that she couldn't stay there any longer. Now, standing at the entrance of this oppressive fortress, she was unsure if she was heading towards safety or into a deeper abyss. After some convincing, the guards allowed her in. They escorted her to the visitation area, the halls eerily quiet except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. The oppressive weight of the building pressed down on her, but Emily forced herself to move forward. Noah was already seated when she entered, his hands shackled, his posture calm but expectant. He looked at her as though he had been waiting, as though he knew she would come. "You finally understand, don't you?" he said, his voice soft but carrying an unsettling certainty. Emily set Peter Holloway's notebook on the table between them. "What does she want?" she demanded, her voice sharp with frustration and fear. "Why is this happening to me?" Noah leaned forward, his dark eyes gleaming with something between amusement and pity. "She doesn't want anything. She is. And once you see her, there's no turning back." Emily's hands clenched into fists on the table. "I didn't ask for this," she hissed. "I didn't choose this." Noah's lips curled into a faint smile. "You didn't have to. She chooses. And once she does, she's with you forever." The lights flickered, casting the room into brief intervals of darkness. Emily's pulse quickened, but she held Noah's gaze. "How do I stop it? There has to be a way to end this." He chuckled, the sound low and devoid of humor. "End it? You think you can end her? She doesn't stop. She doesn't leave. The only thing you can do is give in, or," he trailed off, his smile widening. "Or let her take everything." Emily felt the air grow colder. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pressed him further. What do you mean, give in? What does that even look like? Noah didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting upward as though he were listening to something only he could hear. She'll show you, he murmured. She always does. Before Emily could demand more, a sound shattered the tense silence. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a steady thudding, like footsteps coming down the hallway outside. One of the guards appeared at the door, his face pale and eyes wide. There's something wrong, the guard stammered. The lights, something's. He didn't finish his sentence. A shadow moved past the doorway, and the guard disappeared with a muffled cry. The door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. Emily's breathing grew ragged as she fumbled for her phone, using its dim light to illuminate the space. Across the table, Noah's face remained calm, his expression almost serene. She's here now, he whispered. The words sent a chill through Emily's entire body. The darkness around her felt alive, shifting and pressing against her from every side. She turned her phone's light toward the door, but there was nothing there. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though it were being drained from the room. Why are you doing this? Emily shouted, her voice breaking. Noah's laughter echoed through the room. It's not me, Doctor. It's her. She's chosen you. And now, there's no escape. The lights flickered back on for a brief moment, and Emily saw it. In the corner of the room, a shadowed figure stood. It was tall, its form indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. The lights went out again, leaving her in complete darkness. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. She turned back to Noah, but his chair was empty. A deep, guttural sound filled the room, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through her chest. The shadow moved closer, and Emily felt the temperature drop further. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down to see a message on the screen. You know what to do. No, Emily whispered, shaking her head. I won't. The humming grew louder, the shadow inching closer. Emily clenched her fists, forcing herself to stand despite the overwhelming weight pressing down on her. I won't, she screamed, the words echoing in the empty room. The humming stopped abruptly, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once, spoke directly into her mind. You will. The door burst open, and light flooded the room. The guard from earlier stumbled inside, his face pale and drenched in sweat. What the hell is going on in here? He demanded, his voice shaking. The shadow was gone. Noah's chair was still empty, and Emily stood trembling, her breathing uneven. She turned to the guard, but she couldn't find the words to explain. Without looking back, she grabbed her bag and ran from the room. As she left the prison, the air outside felt heavier than before. The world seemed darker, quieter, as though something had shifted permanently. And Emily knew this wasn't over. Emily stumbled out of the prison, her legs trembling and her breath ragged. The world outside felt wrong, too still, too quiet, as though something fundamental had shifted. Rain drizzled from the overcast sky, mingling with the sweat on her skin as she made her way to her car. Her mind raced, Noah's words reverberating in her head, "She's with you forever." She gripped the steering wheel, staring at the prison gates through the windshield. Her instinct was to drive far away, to put as much distance as possible between herself and what she had just experienced. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Noah was right, there was no escaping her. The rain intensified as Emily drove home, the windshield wipers swiping rhythmically against the glass. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The shadows in the back seat seemed to shift with every passing streetlight, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the house stood eerily still, the windows dark and lifeless. Emily hesitated, gripping her keys tightly. Every fiber of her being screamed not to go inside, but she pushed the thought away. She had nowhere else to go. The moment she stepped inside, the silence hit her like a physical force. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, it was something alive, something that pressed against her ears and filled the space around her. Emily set her bag down and turned on the lights, but the faint hum of the bulb seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Her eyes were drawn to the kitchen table. Peter Holloway's notebook lay open, though she was certain she had closed it before leaving. The words scrawled across the page were jagged and hurried, "It's too late." Emily backed away, her breathing uneven. The air in the room grew colder, and a faint whisper tickled the edges of her hearing. She spun around, her eyes scanning every corner of the room, but it was empty. The lights flickered, plunging her into darkness for a brief second before they returned. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as a low, rhythmic thudding began upstairs. It wasn't footsteps this time, it was something slower, heavier, deliberate. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled it out with shaking hands. A new message illuminated the screen, "You know what you have to do." Emily's hands trembled so violently she almost dropped the phone. The same message Noah had spoken in her dream now stared back at her in stark text. She turned toward the stairs, her feet moving of their own accord, her body compelled to follow the sound. Each step felt like a descent into a deeper darkness. The thudding grew louder, resonating through the walls, the vibrations seeming to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. When she reached the top of the stairs, she hesitated outside her bedroom door. It was closed, but the faintest sliver of light seeped from the crack beneath it. Emily placed her hand on the doorknob, the cold metal biting into her palm. She took a deep breath and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the room exactly as she had left it, except for the mirror. The mirror on the wall now faced her directly, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Emily stepped closer, her reflection distorted and shifting. Then, as she reached out to touch it, the image solidified into something else. It wasn't her reflection. It was the figure Dot. Tall, featureless, its form seemed to shift and writhe as though it was made of smoke. Its empty face turned toward her, and for a moment, Emily felt like the world had stopped. Her chest tightened, and she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, not in the mirror, but in the room. The lights flickered again, and the whispering began, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. Emily stumbled back, her hands over her ears, but the sound was inside her head. "It's time," the voices said in unison. "Choose." "No!" Emily screamed, her voice breaking as she fell to her knees. Tears streamed down her face as she fought to hold on to the last shred of control she had left. "I won't let you take me." The voices quieted, replaced by a low hum. The figure stood motionless, its empty face still fixed on her. Then, it spoke, not aloud, but directly into her mind. "You already have." The lights flared, blinding her, and when Emily opened her eyes, she was no longer in her bedroom. She was in the prison again, sitting across from Noah. But he wasn't shackled anymore. He leaned forward, his black eyes boring into hers. "You never had a choice," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "She's already inside you." Emily tried to speak, but no words came. The walls around her began to melt, the room dissolving into shadows that swallowed everything. She was falling, weightless, her screams lost in the void. And then, silence. When Emily woke, she was back in her house, lying on the living room floor. The lights were on, and everything looked normal, too normal. She sat up slowly, her head pounding. The notebook was gone, the photo of her and her mother back on the wall, its shadowy figure absent. But the feeling hadn't left. She could still feel it, lingering in the corners, watching. Emily knew this wasn't the end. Emily woke on the cold floor of her living room, her body aching as though she had been crushed under an invisible weight. The light streaming through the window was muted, the morning sun struggling to pierce the heavy clouds outside. She sat up slowly, her head pounding, her thoughts fragmented. The house was quiet, unnervingly so. The air felt thick, and every sound she made seemed to echo unnaturally. Her eyes drifted to the wall where the photo of her and her mother hung. The shadowy figure that had loomed in the background was no longer there. Emily got to her feet, her movements stiff and robotic. The absence of the shadow should have felt like a relief, but it didn't. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. Everything seemed ordinary, yet nothing felt right. She moved to the kitchen, needing the routine of making coffee to ground herself. The mundane task of pouring water and measuring grounds was a welcome distraction from the gnawing sense of dread. But as she stood there, waiting for the coffee to brew, she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Emily turned slowly, her breath catching. The kitchen was empty, but the feeling didn't fade. Her gaze fell to the window above the sink, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure in the reflection. But when she turned to look directly, there was nothing. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a cup of coffee, spilling some onto the counter. She cursed under her breath and grabbed a towel to clean up, but when she looked up again, the reflection in the window was different. It wasn't her. Emily froze, the towel slipping from her hands. The figure in the reflection was tall, indistinct, its form shifting and flickering like static on a broken TV screen. Its face, or the absence of one, was turned directly toward her. She spun around, but the kitchen was empty. When she turned back to the window, her own reflection had returned. Emily backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of the house, out of the town, away from everything. But where could she go? Noah's words echoed in her mind, "She's with you forever." Summoning her courage, Emily climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She grabbed a duffel bag and began shoving clothes and essentials into it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely zip it shut. As she moved to leave, her eyes caught the mirror on the far wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, distorting her reflection. She froze, her legs rooted to the spot as the distortion solidified into the figure she had seen before. It stepped closer, its featureless face impossibly directed at her, though it had no eyes. Emily opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her chest felt tight, her breath catching as the figure leaned forward. Its form began to shift, and for a horrifying moment, she realized it was becoming her. The reflection now wore her face, but the eyes were wrong, empty, dark voids that seemed to pull her in. The air around her grew heavy, pressing against her chest. Then, the reflection spoke, its voice not a sound but a thought that invaded her mind. "You see it now, don't you?" Emily stumbled back, her hands grasping for the door frame. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "This isn't real." The reflection smiled, a cold, unnatural twist of her own lips. "It's more real than you are." The room spun, the walls seeming to close in around her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will the figure away, but when she opened them again, it wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was standing right in front of her. Emily's scream finally tore free, raw and primal, as she threw herself backward. She hit the floor hard, her head spinning. When she looked up, the figure was gone. The room was still, the mirror reflecting nothing but her disheveled self. She staggered to her feet, clutching the edge of the dresser for support. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at her reflection, waiting for it to change again. But it didn't. Slowly, she stepped back, her legs trembling. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Emily sat on the couch, her coffee forgotten on the kitchen counter. She stared at the empty wall across from her, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something. But deep down, she knew there was nothing she could do. She was already hers. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt meaningless now. The light outside began to fade as the day turned to night. Emily didn't move from the couch, her body too drained to do anything but exist. When she finally gathered the strength to stand, she made her way to the bathroom. The mirror above the sink was fogged from the humidity, though she hadn't turned on the shower. She wiped it with a trembling hand, revealing her reflection. For a moment, it looked normal. Then, as she stared, words began to form in the fog on the glass, written by an invisible hand, "Still here." Emily backed away, her heart pounding as the reflection in the mirror shifted. It wasn't her anymore. It was the figure, staring back at her with its empty, dark voids. She turned and fled, but as she moved through the house, every window, every reflective surface, showed the same thing, the figure, watching her. Waiting. Finally, she collapsed onto the floor in the center of the living room. Her body trembled, her mind on the edge of breaking. She clutched her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth as she whispered to herself, over and over, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But she knew it was Dot. The reflection had become her reality.